King of the Harem Heaven, Chapter 3. At the time when Ben, Mary, and little Hetty Purnell first arrived at the new and latter house of Israel, Mike Mills was having harem trouble. Lovely young Bernice Bickle wanted no part of this lecherous, long-haired man more than twice her age, angelic messenger or not. Obedience was stubbornly refusing to obey her prince. Mills had known William and Elizabeth Bickle, who lived across the river in Toronto for some time. They were Israelites in good standing, devoted followers of his. But not until the autumn before he had particularly noticed their daughter now budding out in a way that belied her age. Playing the piano and singing hymns at a revival meeting, she'd made a deep and lasting impression on him. Bernice was a blue-eyed, pouring-lipped young lady, round-faced, almost doll-like, with her light brown hair and the ringlets that were fashionable at the time. Only a few faint freckles remained on her cheeks as reminders that she was scarcely more than a child. Her parents had been investing for many years in her piano and voice lessons. Her playing was mature and skilled, her singing warm and husky. But it was the fresh near plumpness of her young body that caught and held the eye of the bearded prophet. Breasts that strained enticingly, playing fantastic tricks with her blouse on each of the quick breaths she drew between hymn stanzas. Full-fleshed, rounded hips that even the drab loose-cut skirts considered proper for Israelite daughters could not hide. Prince Michael had returned to his godhouse in Detroit, slumped immediately into a trance, then come awake to announce a new revelation. The Almighty had ordered that the 15-year-old Bickle girl become the 10th piece of the Godhead. Writing to the Bickles to give them the news, he'd sent $10, suggesting they change it into 10 Canadian gold pieces as a present for Bernice. He'd cited the parable of the talents, also insisting that the gold pieces would represent the 10 pieces in the Godhead, but the money had actually been a bribe. The girl's parents had been highly flattered and they'd moved immediately into the Detroit colony. Honoring her mother and father, as her Bible told her to do, Bernice had obeyed their order that she go live in Mills' godhouse on Hamlin Avenue while they rented quarters elsewhere. But nothing in the scripture had prepared her for the eager-eyed, eager-handed, long-bearded man who'd greeted her. "My sweet little Bernice." He gripped her shoulders tightly. "Welcome to Godhouse, my dear. Come to me." Her body stiffened. She closed her eyes and bit her lower lip as that strange-eyed face, framed completely by long hair, moved down on her, as he pulled her against him and kissed her gently on the forehead, his beard bristling against her nose and mouth. But when his hand left her shoulders and moved on down her sides with his thumbs and fingers digging in hungrily, she shoved hard against him and then backed away crying. "I want to go home. I don't want to stay here." "Bernice," shaking his head slowly, he smiled. "You're tired and upset, child. You were called by the Lord to come and place yourself in obedience to Michael, his son. It has been revealed that you represent the 10th piece in the Godhead. All Israel envies you. Of course, you want to stay." She glanced fearfully at him, then looked away again. "I don't like it when you grab me like that," she pouted. Patient and generous, Prince Mike gave her 2 whole days to become acclimatized. He sent her to sleep with his wife and an older harem member the first night. On the second, he had her share a room with another young newcomer, a girl who didn't seem quite as rebellious. He visited the 2 of them that evening, giving them a box of candy, sitting on the side of the bed and talking to them for nearly an hour, then saying goodnight. On the 3rd evening, he'd ordered Bernice sent to his room, waiting until he was sure she was in bed before entering. "Dear Bernice," he took her head and patted it. "When I first heard you playing the piano so beautifully, I dreamt that someday you would play for us here at Godhouse." She stared at him in suspicious silence. "When the ingathering of Israel is completed, my dear, you'll play before the vast throng of 144,000. I promise you that." Quickly and matter-of-factly, he shed his clothes and slipped into bed beside her. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Smiling kindly, he explained that this was something necessary to her salvation, an essential part of preparing her for an important role in the only society that would exist once the millennium came. In great detail, he described the beauties and wonders of the kingdom that awaited those who were faithful and loyal and obedient to the 7th divine messenger. It was not her place to try to understand all the intricacies of the various ways her fitness for the millennium might be tested. he pointed out, only to have faith in the word of God as it came down through his servants, the prophets. You are to symbolize obedience to all Israel, he told her. Are you willing to obey me, Bernice? He let his fingers trail lightly along her leg. No, she decided, not like that. Dear Bernice, he shook his head smiling, you must obey me in everything. He slipped his arm around her, pulled her against him and rubbed her back. No, she stiffened at his touch. Still smiling, he explained to her that the divine fire had burned all evil out of his body, leaving him completely pure, and that all he wanted to do was to sow the seeds of the same purity in her, that if this was not done, Satan would sow evil there. Whispering his arguments close to her ear, he let his lips move up into her hair, then back down across the warm curve of her neck. He began kissing her breast reverently through the flimsy material of her nightgown, then slid his hand hungrily into the baby's soft coolness. Her body tightened with anger, and she tried to push him away. He held her there, struggling and breathing hard, for a long moment, staring wet-eyed at the way her fast-pulsing gasps played tricks with the cloth of her gown. But when she began screaming, he gave up for the time being. Choose what you want, he warned her grimly, life or death. The Lord will have a willing people and none other. He then turned his attention to cleansing the blood of Bernice's less stubborn roommate of the night before. Several weeks passed before he made another attempt on the rebellious new harem member. During this time, Eliza Court, the senior piece in the Godhead, worked on her steadily. With sharp, hissing words and an occasional stinging slap, the older woman reminded Bernice that being here was a great honor and privilege and urged her to do as she was told. Don't you realize Prince Michaels is different from other men? You little fool, she snapped. Can't you understand that everything he does is right and good? No, the teenage girl pouted. Eliza failed, and once again Prince Mike ordered Bernice sent to his room. This time he armed himself with a Bible, a copy of the Flying Roll, and a number of old Roite sermons. For several hours he read and interpreted various passages for her. But once again, when he slid into bed beside her, she pulled away. You're a little tease, aren't you? His preaching voice gave way to a soft chuckle. No, I'm not. Still laughing, he reached over and lifted her nightgown. She jerked it back down immediately. He jumped up in exasperation. The Lord is extremely angry, he warned her. For 3 full weeks, I've allowed a person of unclean blood to occupy an exalted position in his abode, and a mockery has been made of the virtue of obedience. Unless your blood is cleansed very quickly, you'll be in your grave. Bernice lay awake most of the night, sobbing softly. Raised by fanatic parents, she was deeply religious. Fear of death and eternal punishment racked her young body. Visions of fire and brimstone torched her mind. Prince Mike gave her more than another month to become adjusted to the situation, to realize that all the other girls were accepting his unique form of ministering. During this time, he took all the pieces of the Godhead with him on a missionary tour to England, enjoying a luxurious ocean voyage while the cultists went on slaving to support him. But upon his return to Detroit, he found himself unable to think of anything else but this infuriating, maddening, still unclaimed little beauty, and he'd sent Eliza Court to bring Bernice once again to his room. With whom have you been sleeping, child? He asked in the tone of voice a schoolmaster might use to scold a pupil. With Mrs. Mills, she choked, afraid of him. He nodded grimly. I thought so. Do you know that Mrs. Mills is evil and rebellious, Bernice? Do you know that I've had to put handcuffs on her and lock her in the closet more than once? Do you want me to have to do that with you? No. All right then. You're to sleep with Sister Eliza and myself in the hope that our purity can combat the evil you've contracted from Mrs. Mills. The 3 of them lay together for some time that night, while Prince Mike and Sister Eliza lectured the girl on the necessity of having the seeds of purity planted in her blood. Eventually, the long-haired prince tapped his senior harem member on the shoulder, and she slipped out of bed and left the room. Now, Bernice, Mike Mills announced grimly, I must have obedience. Her entire body was shaking, tightening and wrinkling her nightgown enticingly. He caught both her wrists, twisted them behind her back and held them there with one hand, while the other caressed her legs, then explored beneath her gown, moving up along the fullness of her young thighs, across the slight roundness of her stomach, onto her heaving breasts. Her head was moving steadily from side to side, her crying, her attempts to twist away, the steady shuddering of her shoulders, the trembling of her teeth when he kissed her. All this served only to heighten his excitement and eagerness. "Stop it," she begged. "Please stop it." "Hold still, goddammit," he snarled in a shouted whisper, with the full weight of his chest and shoulders pinning her tightly. With her arms locked numbly beneath her, she tried to jerk her knees up to block him, but he forced them back down. His mouth was searching steadily for the lips that twisted away from his kisses, his beard dragging over her throat, his long hair hanging down on all sides of her head. His free hand tugged her nightgown on up, fumbled for a moment beneath him, then joined his other behind her. He let her arms go free as his own clenched her tightly against him, but she could only beat her fists weakly and futilely against his sides. "Please don't," she sobbed. "You're hurting me." Obedience was finally obtained. The Godhead was complete. Israel was secure. As Benjamin Purnell looked over the prince's domain in open admiration and hidden envy, he immediately spotted the one serious flaw in the very foundations of the new and latter house of Israel. The single vulnerable point at which a shrewd and skilled attack might very well topple the entire structure. The legal Mrs. Mills, now living in Godhouse and treated like just another piece of the Godhead by the prince, was a jealous and vengeful woman, as unreasonable. Ben Purnell decided, as his own first wife Angelina had been. Ben could see nothing in Sister Mills that remotely resembled attractiveness, but business was business, and first things had to come first. He combed out his colorful hair, groomed his new beard, and went to work. While Prince Mike was amusing himself with teenagers, Ben Purnell turned every ounce of his charm loose on the prince's wife. At first he merely listened sympathetically to her complaints about the way her husband was mistreating her, tenderly comforting her loneliness. But gradually, as the weeks went by and their relationship became very close, he began subtly feeding her anger and encouraging her growing dissatisfaction. "Don't you sometimes think it's strange?" He'd be puzzled, sincerely puzzled, because at all times and above all else, Benjamin Purnell was convincingly sincere. "It was a woman who organized the Israelites in the first place, but all of the messengers ever since have been men. Why, except for Sister Eliza, not one of the pillars here is a woman. I've had my doubts about Michael for a long, long time," she'd confide in a whisper as they huddled together in some secluded corner. "These people here think he's an angel from heaven, but there's some things I could tell you, believe me. He never even heard of the Israelites until 4 years ago, and before that, well, all I can say is that he just wasn't the kind of man the good Lord would pick to do his work, not by a long sight. I wouldn't think of questioning the prince." Ben would be shocked at the very thought. "But there's one other thing I can't help wondering about. I can't find a thing about this Godhead business there." "Those girls just might not be around here too much longer," Mrs. Mills would hint mysteriously. Naturally enough, Ben was playing both sides of the street. Having worked his way into Mike Mills' confidence, he egged him on in every conceivable way to infuriate his wife still further. He'd approached the divine messenger with the pain-solemn look of a man performing an unpleasant but necessary duty. "Certainly, Brother Benjamin," the prince would put him at ease. "What is it?" "Well, a lot of the women are complaining about Sister Mills. They say she's getting all kinds of extra privileges. They say she doesn't work and never goes out to sell the sacred writings or anything, and yet she lives better than any of the rest of them. The way they see it, just the fact that you were married to her before the soul of the angelic messenger entered into you doesn't entitle her to all that. I just thought I ought to tell you." Prince Mike would nod slowly. "I'm pleased you did, Brother Benjamin. I'll take this problem under careful consideration." From the beginning, Ben Purnell was confident that this line of attack would eventually unseat the prince. But he was pleasantly surprised when it took only a few months. The explosion came that spring. even more violent than he'd intended. He lit the final fuse by approaching Mike Mills with a new suggestion. "Some of the men are feeling envy, Prince Michael, and envy's an evil thing." "What kind of envy, Brother Benjamin?" "Envy because of the girls in the Godhead," Ben told him. The seventh angelic messenger blew his top. "They have no right. That is naked heresy. None of them has any right to question me. Their duty is to obey God's orders as they come down through me in Revelation." I know, Ben soothed him. "It's just that they're only human and human flesh is weak. I have no patience with such weakness. I'd never mentioned it except that I had an idea how to destroy this envy." "I see no need to pamper heresy." The prince had been firm, warily guarding against any suggestion that he share his harem. "No, of course not," Ben agreed. "But suppose you set up a system, the Almighty willing, of course, for the little people to swap wives once in a while. I've been reading in John Rowe's writings that a system like that will be used in the final kingdom to wipe out envy, to prevent one man from coveting another's wife. Maybe it should be started now." Prince Mike considered this carefully, then told his chief pillar that he'd have to wait for word from higher up. But evidently the idea appealed to Mills. Just a few days later there was a new trance, a new revelation, and a new edict from the Israelites. From now on, the wives of the colony would be rotated among the men on a fair and impartial basis. For Sister Mills, this was the last straw. A chummy secret friendship with a good-looking young man was one thing. Being passed from crackpot to crackpot in this weird community was something else entirely. When the prince told her she would have to obey his edicts the same as any other Israelite woman, she set the halls of God House ringing with loud language that didn't resemble Bible quotations in the slightest, slammed out the front door, and marched directly to the office of the first lawyer she could find. She then initiated suit for divorce, naming Eliza Court as correspondent, naming the prince's other mistresses in her charges, and talking freely about what had gone on in the new and latter house of Israel to anyone who cared to listen, reporters included. Once the details of bedroom life at God House came out in the Detroit newspapers, strong public feeling was aroused. On March 30, a large mob of Northside citizens marched up Hamlin Avenue, massed tightly in front of Mills's home, and began smashing the windows. "Out with the long hairs! Burn 'em out! Burn 'em out!" they chanted murderously, very much like a cheering section at a football game. "Out with the long hairs! Burn 'em out! Burn 'em out!" The police arrived in time to disperse the crowd, but Mike Mills saw what was in the wind. With elaborate cryptic oaths, he swore each of his harem girls to secrecy, then called a meeting of the pillars of Israel. "I have been divinely commissioned to preach the Israelite gospel over the entire world, not merely here in this little corner," he announced. Ben Purnell and the others noticed that he was extremely nervous, that his hands were shaking. Very suddenly, the bearded prince began singing a well-known missionary hymn. "In the deserts let me labor, on the mountains let me tell, how he died, the blessed Savior, to redeem a world from hell. Let me hasten, far in heathen lands to dwell." Just as abruptly, the long-haired prophet's singing stopped. "Do any of you know how far it is to New Zealand?" he demanded. Ben and the other pillars scratched their heads and exchanged puzzled glances. "Or possibly Australia?" the seventh messenger asked weakly. It was too late for running, though. A newly formed committee of angry Northside citizens had convinced Mrs. Mills she should sign a criminal complaint charging both Mike and Eliza with lascivious cohabitation. And on April 11th, the police raided God House, arresting the prince and his spiritual affinity, taking the other harem members into protective custody. Dragged down Hamlin Avenue, kicking and shouting, Prince Michael called down every curse imaginable upon the heads of the officers. "You will all die horribly," he shrieked. "All who are involved in this outrage will die of horrible disease." He was hauled into Recorder's Court and brought before the Honorable Fitzwilliam H. Chambers for a preliminary hearing.
"Silence in the court!"
"How do you plead to this charge?" the judge asked. "I refuse to plead before an earthly court," Mills told him. "Only God can judge me." "Are you represented by counsel?" "I have no need of earthly counsel. God is my counsel, and God will protect me." In spite of the way he sounded, Mike Mills was no fool. When the legal firm of Atkinson, Carpenter, Brooks, and Haig, headed by the famous Colonel John Atkinson, one of the greatest criminal lawyers in the country, volunteered to defend him free of charge, the prince swallowed his contempt for earthly counsel and received the new revelation that God was willing to share his defense with a mere lawyer. Mrs. Mills suffered a nervous breakdown, dropped her charges, and fled into Canada. But by that time, several of the Harem girls had given statements and new charges were ready. Colonel Atkinson filed a plea of not guilty for the prince on May 4. Immediately after the arrest, the police and public officials had been pestered constantly by angry flying rollers who'd protested this blasphemy, this insult to their leaders and degradation of their faith. And no one had been louder and more eloquent in condemning this outrage than Ben Purnell, who'd worked tirelessly for months to bring it about. But the authorities had a far more serious problem on their hands than the indignation of the Israelites. As the people of Detroit began waking up to what had gone on in their midst, as the pathetic stories told by Bernice Bickle and the other girls were played for all they were worth in boosting newspaper circulation, public fury became murderous. At a gigantic mass meet held at Brown's Hall, lynching was openly advocated. Even though the police were present, the press was screaming for blood. "After the long hairs, they must get out of the north side of Detroit," one editorial was headed. "Flying roller colony, north side citizens want it wiped out," another stated. The home of Israelite William Brown on Lyman Place was mobbed in mid-May. Every window was broken and the entire front of the house was smashed in. A short time later, Israelite Thomas Dooley, walking with his wife down Hamlin Avenue, was captured by another mob. Mrs. Dooley was shoved roughly aside and her husband was publicly horsewhipped. Not long afterwards, Prince Michael set out to walk to the offices of Atkinson, Carpenter, Brooks, and Haig for a strategy conference. Ben Purnell and another trusted pillar named Ed Durand went with him. A few outsiders had followed Durand from his home at 706 Wabash, jeering him constantly. As the three long-haired bearded men hurried on their way, the crowd grew steadily larger, collecting new hecklers at every corner. Obscenities were shouted. Violence seemed certain to come, but Mills and Purnell and Durand finally ducked safely into the office building. After a long conference with Colonel Atkinson, Prince Mike emerged smiling. The colonel had been unable to defeat a prosecution move to have his bail increased from $1,000 to $3,000, and the money would have to be raised somehow. In some way, a full report of that meeting at which he asked about New Zealand and Australia had gotten into the hands of the police. Ben Purnell was sincerely indignant. Was there a traitor among the pillars? Even so, Mills seemed happy, genuinely confident, more sure of himself than he'd been at any time since his arrest. The colonel had ordered him to tell absolutely no one what they talked about, but he'd say this much: the Lord would be providing a few tricks in behalf of his faithful servant. Look for a couple big surprises, he hinted. The smile vanished from the prince's face when they left the building. The crowd outside had grown steadily. Several thousand people were massed there now, and their angry muttering was becoming a strange growling roar, the unearthly sound of a crowd becoming a mob. The three Israelite men were trapped against the wall. Prince Mike waved his arms and tried to talk to them. "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," he shouted. But the first stone had already been cast, along with heavy sticks, pieces of coal, and apples and potatoes from an overturned vendor's cart. Missiles snarled through the air in a steady shower. Ben Purnell and Ed Durand buried their faces in their arms and huddled against the brick wall. But the prince went on attempting to preach to the mob. Struck several times in the face, he was bleeding badly. A half-dozen men rushed in and began clubbing him. Suddenly, the shrill sounds of police whistles split the air. Skillfully and efficiently, at considerable risk to their own necks, the officers fought their way through to drive off the attackers with swinging nightsticks, forming a tight ring around the three bearded men and protecting them while other members of the Detroit police began the long, tricky task of breaking up the mob. This was the same Detroit Police Department Prince Mike's attorney would later attack viciously. accusing the officers of everything from joining a conspiracy against the prince to taking indecent liberties with the harem girls who were being held in protected custody at the Woodbridge police station. The long-haired prophet was safe for the moment, but the situation was growing steadily more dangerous. New lynch mobs kept forming and were broken up, only to form again, immediately. The Israelites were stoned and beaten whenever they were seen on the street. There seemed little chance of the prince ever getting to trial alive, and finally the state troopers smuggled him off to Ann Arbor, with a change of venue being granted on June 6. In that sleepy little college town, the trial of the bearded prophet was, of course, a sensational one. On its opening day, June 14th, class attendance at the University of Michigan hit an all-time low, as the students rushed to the county courthouse for a glimpse into a brand of theology seldom discussed in texts. Every seat in the courtroom was taken. The hall outside was tightly jammed. Even the courthouse lawn was crowded. In an attempt to lessen the embarrassment of the girls who had to testify, no male spectators were allowed in the first 2 rows of benches on the side that faced the witness stand. This section was tied off with a white ribbon and reserved for an organized group of older women from various reputable churches, who were there specifically to sympathize with and encourage the former harem girls. In the row on the other side reserved for defense witnesses, a number of Israelite pillars and even a few of the little people waited to testify for their prince, to describe his immaculate character and his purity of conduct. Benjamin Franklin Purnell sat among them, and like the rest, his face was frozen into the bitter grimace of self-righteousness, of distaste for this absurd indignity. But unlike the rest, his eyes were smiling. His eyes were practically laughing out loud.